I'd like to turn our attention to your experience in running the Girl Scouts.
Leading.
Thank you. The Girl Scouts of the USA. We've already touched on some of that. When you think back on that period, what was the most important thing that you learned about leadership from your own experience in being in that role?
Well, you come in and you have a marvelous organization. The troops are working at the local level. But the 335 councils are on an island somewhere way over here. And then you have something called the national organization. And I knew if we couldn't build one great movement, not two separate organizations, but one great movement, building that kind of cohesion and passion for the movement. Mm-hmm. You know, one mission, one movement. We live the values. And you can't do it with lovely speeches from New York any more than you can sit at your desk in New York and say, let there be diversity and have anything happen. You see, it happens on the ground where the people are. Mm-hmm. So when you are designing this massive transformation, who are the people engaged? The people in the councils. They're indispensable partners. Everyone plays a role. Mm-hmm. So it's theirs.
It's theirs. They have to own it. They have to feel it.
They own it. And it has to be real. It isn't a nice little speech I make. It's the life they are living. Mm-hmm. And then we distill language. We don't have 10 messages. We have a little handful. Mm-hmm. We manage for the mission. We managed for innovation, and we were wildly innovative. We were famous for throwing out the people in boxes and the hierarchical language, and on our website there's an article, Managing in a World That Is Round, flat, circular, remarkable, and then you have to throw out the hierarchical language. No more top, bottom, up, down, subordinate, superior. Have you ever heard a young person say, I can't wait to be a subordinate? Of course not. Throw them out. It's we, it's us. It's ours. Circular management. Our marvelous staff loved it, and in the first couple hours it had a name. They called it the bubble chart because everybody was in circles. And Peter Drucker saw it. He said, oh, I don't think it's the bubble chart. I think it's the wheel of fortune.
The terms that are used, the labels that are used, the language. So you were very careful about that.
Powerful messages you beam over and over. And then when you look at the organization and you realize it does not reflect the face of America. And so you decide this is where we invest. So you have some marvelous training of how to appreciate all those different cultures. And we found, we did research. How do those 5 major racial ethnic communities, how do they view us? We knew we wanted them, but, quote, we were waiting for them to come in. They wanted us, but they didn't know how to access. So we just moved out. And with some marvelous training, we quickly more than tripled racial ethnic representation right across the organization.
My guess is that you probably had to do a lot of experimentation to figure out the right way to get that done.
We had the best training in the world and the best research in the world. We didn't tinker around with trying to guess what do they think. No. Solid research. Dr. Robert Hill was the researcher for National Urban League, and I asked Vernon Jordan, may we please have him to do this research? How do they feel about us? We know how we feel about them. We don't want to guess. And I said, we'll pay his salary, Vernon will give him to you.
Before we close up here, I want to ask you maybe a question or two about how you came to find your calling and know what it is that you're about, because that's really the essence, I think, of what our primary theme has been in this conversation, is enabling others to do that. Well, somehow it happened to you. Someone probably helped you with that, I'm guessing. Can you recall a defining episode in your own growing up or your early life that somehow influenced or shaped your future and your capacity to contribute to others?
I'll answer it in two ways. One, I've had 5 professional jobs, all president CEOs. I never applied for one of them. Obviously, I know nothing about career planning or long-range planning. Someone opened the door and shoved me in. Mm-hmm. I was a volunteer, national volunteer, world volunteer, first woman to chair the United Way campaign in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Volunteer for the rest of my life. I was pushed into taking the local Girl Scout CEO job in Johnstown, and I said, well, I'm sorry, but I am a volunteer. So these 3 men who were having lunch with me, and very prestigious people, said, well, that's too bad, because the Girl Scouts are in serious trouble. And so I said, all right, I'll take it for 6 months. We'll get the finances straightened out. Then we'll find a real leader. 1 month later, I realized it was a great adventure. 4 years later, after we had experimented with all kinds of marvelous contemporary program and circular management, I had a call from the eastern part of Pennsylvania. We want you to come. So I went for 18 months, and New York called, we want you to come to New York. Now, I knew they weren't serious. They had never had someone from within the organization as a CEO. So I wasn't. My husband was living there, and he was marvelous. I said, John, I'm not going. They're not serious. They've never had anyone from within. He said, it's a perfect job for you. I'm driving you to New York. So I went. We discussed the job. And because I guess I was so relaxed because I knew they were just proving, they were casting the widest net. And they said, well, if you did this job, take it, what would you do? So I described the quiet revolution, the total transformation of the organization. I had a wonderful time. If I'd wanted a job, I might have been more discreet. Went home. 2 days later, they called, we want you to come to New York. So those are my 4 jobs. And all 3 CEO of Girl Scout, something or other. And the 4th one, when I thought I had agreed to be the chairman of the Peter Drucker Foundation, Peter growled and said, you won't be the chairman, you'll be the CEO and run it or it won't work. So those are my 4 professional jobs. Now, someone opened a door. Call it providential, call it whatever. But each one was exactly what I should have been doing. And I don't know how I was reading everything I should have read, preparing, speaking a lot around the world and somehow, and around the country, somehow.
Well, but was there some moment, a defining moment perhaps, earlier, and maybe we can close on this, that really helped to shape how you saw yourself in the world and define your identity and your values?
I was speaking to 250 chief learning officers of corporations. As you can imagine, the dialogue that followed, very significant questions. The final one, Mrs. Hesselbein, what was the one defining moment in your life that determined the person you are, the leader you have become? No one had ever asked me that, and I found myself responding. I said, I was 8 years old. I adored my grandparents. They lived 9 miles from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in South Fork, a little mining and railroad town. And they had a large family, 7 children, so they built a big house. My grandfather had a little men's clothing store. He sold suits and shoes to miners and to railroad workers. He played the pipe organ in the Methodist church every Sunday morning. And he and my grandmother thought it was perfectly normal to build in a pipe organ into their own house, the size of a small church pipe organ. I loved it. And on the shelf above the keyboards were 2 old, beautiful Chinese vases. And every time I went, every weekend, every time I went, I would walk into this music room with this 18-foot ceiling, and I would look at the vases and say, please, may I play with them? Or please, may I touch them? And my grandmother would say, no, no one can ever touch them. So this one Saturday, I guess I was feeling very assertive. I'm 8 years old, so I actually stamped my foot at my grandmother and said, I want those vases. Instead of telling me I was a bad girl, she led me over to a little love seat that faced the pipe organ and the vases. She said, let me tell you the story about those vases. Long ago, in this little town, there's a Chinese laundryman. He wore traditional Chinese dress, had a long queue. And sometimes your mother and her little sisters would come home from school crying that the bad boys were chasing Mr. Yi and teasing him and calling him Chinky Chinaman and worse. And every week he picked up my grandfather's shirts. 2 days later brought them back, beautifully washed, starched, ironed. And this was her story. And she held me and we washed the vases. One day, she said, there was a knock on the kitchen door, and I went to the door, and there was Mr. Yi standing with a big package wrapped in newspaper. And I said, well, Mr. Yi, please, won't you come in? Won't you sit down? And he just stood there and handed her the package. This is for you. She unwrapped the package, and there were these 2 exquisite Chinese vases. And he said, this is all I brought with me to this country, and I'm leaving. I'm going back home. They won't let me bring my wife and children here, and I miss them too much. And here was a Chinese laundryman in this little white shed-like building. The front was a counter for the laundry. He slept in the back. So he said, I'm going back home, and I want you to have these vases. And my grandmother said, but Mr. Yi, why do you want me to have these vases? He looked at her, and he had tears. He said, Mrs. Wicks, I have been here 10 years, and you are the only person who ever called me Mr. Yi. I can remember I cried my heart out. My grandmother held me. I cried and cried. 1998, I'm in the White House, a January morning, and I am about to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. It's our country's highest civilian award. Here, sitting in our little row, David Rockefeller, Dr. Robert Coles of Harvard, James Farmer, the great civil rights leader, Admiral Zumwalt. We're all sitting there. And when it's my turn, the President and Mrs. Clinton they each had a lectern. And he would say, Admiral Zumwalt, will you please come up? And the naval commander would help him put the beautiful medal around, and they would read a citation. When it was my turn, the President said, Francis Hesselbein, I will ask this pioneer for women diversity, volunteerism, and inclusion. Will you please, Frances Hesselbein, will you please come forward? When I stood up, I thought of my grandmother and Mr. Yee. They were with me. I was being recognized for something that began when I was 8 years old, respect for all people.
You mentioned earlier about thinking about 20 years out and the greatest generation, the kids coming up now, as you think about how people will reflect on your legacy. What do you think they'll be most mindful of?
I hope they will say, she tried to bring us all together in love and peace and understanding. She really cared about me. And no one ever asked me that. That's straight from my heart.
Thank you again, Frances Hesselbein, for joining me today. It's been an honor and a privilege to chat with you.